I'm now going to show you one mathematical equation. It's extremely simple, so don't be scared. The rate of profit is the total profit over the total price of inputs, profits over inputs. We call the profit S for a surplus value, the amount of additional value added by labor over and above the money paid to workers for their wages. We divide the inputs into two categories: wages paid to workers and expenditures on pre-produced commodities like machines, raw materials, and factories. At the time of buying one of these pre-produced commodities, the capitalist pays a price representing the value of that commodity. This value is then transferred onto the final product, but no additional value can be transferred by a machine or raw material. No surplus value. So we call the value of these pre-produced commodities constant and denote them with C for constant. Since the wages paid to workers are not representative of a specific amount of value that will be produced per worker, that is, since there is no way of knowing how much surplus value a worker will produce, we call their value variable and denote them with V. We can then translate this profits over inputs into S over C plus V, that is, surplus value over the cost of constant and variable capital. This is the standard equation for the rate of profit, that you'll sometimes see it written in slightly different ways. From this equation, it's easy to see that an increase in investment in either constant or variable capital must correspond to a rise in the amount of surplus value in order for the rate of profit to stay the same. If S stays the same while C or V increases, then the rate of profit will fall. In our example of capitalists reducing the socially necessary labor time of widgets, we saw that although some capitalists gained a temporary advantage over others through increased efficiency, ultimately, the same amount of workers produced the same amount of value each hour. The value was just spread out over more widgets. In terms of our equation of surplus value over constant and variable capital, this means that surplus value does not rise just because physical output rises. What does rise is constant capital. In order to increase the efficiency of output, capitalists had to spend more on machines and raw materials. This means that the denominator in the equation is increasing, and this means a falling rate of profit. So now when people say that it doesn't make sense that capitalists would invest in ways that drove down the rate of profit, you can explain to them the following 3 points. 1. We see the price of commodities fall all the time due to increased efficiency. This is a terabyte hard drive. It cost me $100, which is like a third of what it would have cost me a year ago. This means that increased productivity does not mean increased value. The same amount of workers are producing the same amount of value. This value is just spread out over more, cheaper commodities. For some mysterious reason, capitalists keep racing to pump out more and more cheaper commodities, even though it undermines the rate of profit ultimately. 2. Capitalist decisions are not centrally coordinated decisions made for the long-term benefit of the capitalist class. They are totally anarchic, the result of thousands of individual capitalists all competing against one another for temporary short-term market advantage. The immediate, on-the-ground pressure on an individual capitalist is to increase output per worker to achieve maximum possible efficiency without regard to the effect on aggregate values or market saturation. And 3, capitalists do not operate from a conscious labor theory of value. To them, increased physical output means increased profits. This confusion of physical output with value is referred to as physicalism. It is the same theoretical error that confuses many of the critics of the falling rate of profit, like Nobuo Kishio and John Romer. Both capitalists and their bourgeois theorists are stuck in a theoretical quagmire where they think the value of commodities stays the same regardless of how efficient the production process is, while it is quite obvious to any lay observer that the value of commodities is constantly decreasing with rising productivity. There are, however, some countervailing tendencies away from a falling rate of profit. Let's look at them. Again, if you have your thinking cap on, you may have noticed that this entire thesis of the falling rate of profit is predicated on one assumption, that capitalists will increase their investment in constant capital relative to variable capital. The ratio of C to V is usually called the organic composition of capital, though sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the value composition of capital. It should be clear by now that if the organic composition of capital rises, the rate of profit falls. But if the organic composition of capital shrinks, if V rises relative to C, this should counteract the tendency toward a falling rate of profit. Indeed, this was a major strategy in response to the crisis of the early 70s, in which the West found itself with an overaccumulation of constant capital in the form of large factories and other industrial infrastructure. By an increased use of subcontracting in the Third World, firms were able to move production overseas to take advantage of cheaper, easily exploited labor. In many parts of Asia and Latin America, there was no need to increase efficiency via constant capital increases in technology because the labor force, displaced from their rural means of production through deregulation and trade, was so vulnerable and exploitable. While such investment strategies stem the falling rate of profit, they do so by expanding capitalist social relations into new areas on the periphery of capital. In so doing, they don't resolve the contradictions implied in the falling rate of profit. They merely displace these contradictions in space by bringing more people and spaces into the system. In doing so, all sorts of disequilibriums are created in the fabric of capitalist space. The eventual rise to economic power of some areas of the periphery has much to do with the current disequilibrium of international capitalist relations. A second way of stemming the falling rate of profit has to do with decreasing the value of constant capital. If the race to improve efficiency is cheapening all commodities, we can expect the cost of inputs like machines and raw materials to fall as well. This allows capitalists to increase the physical amount of technology they use without increasing the value of constant capital. Unlike the previous fix, which displaced crisis in space, this fix is part of the internal logic of capital and, some argue, could very well be a permanent fix. What should be added, though, is that many production technologies involve very large investments in fixed capital. Fixed capital is constant capital that is fixed in space, like roads, bridges, dams, factories, skyscrapers, enormous machines. An enormous investment in fixed capital commits the investor to the long-term use of this fixed capital, preventing the capitalist from switching to new, cheaper, constant capital. The turnover time of fixed capital investments can be several years to several decades, as the capitalist waits for the cost of a new building or road to pay itself off. Thus, the fix provided by the falling value of constant capital is neutralized in the case of fixed capital investments. The longer an industry has been around, the more automated production tends to be, so there is a tendency toward increasing investments in fixed capital. The problems of turnover time in fixed capital investments are overcome often through the credit system. By borrowing money for investments or borrowing money in expectation of future revenues, capitalists can get the money they need now instead of waiting decades for an investment to pay itself off. In this way, the credit system creates a socially necessary turnover time, which equalizes turnover times across industries, allowing industries with massive fixed capital investments to stay competitive with more labor-intensive industries. This also means that the crisis of overproduction of constant capital and the subsequent falling rate of profit are displaced in time and transferred to the credit system. And this takes us back to our starting point. If capital can make good on all of its credit, we are safe from crisis. But if capital can't generate enough profit relative to investments, if technological change destabilizes value creation in one way or another, we get crisis in the form of bubbles of credit which can't find value, massive factories which can't make a profit, shelves of commodities that can't be sold, and masses of workers without jobs. The falling rate of profit provides a starting point for understanding how all these factors are interrelated. While there are countervailing tendencies away from a falling rate of profit, many of them are mere displacements of crisis, which merely postpone crisis, bottling it up to break out with increasing violence when it can no longer be contained. We must always remember that there is no central coordinating body in a capitalist society to manage investments in a way that stabilizes the rate of profit. And that's why we cannot escape crisis.